Well, good afternoon. And welcome, and I'll ask you if you would to take a seat. Hi, Norm. Why don't I ask the panelists to come right up and take their respective seats, or they may want to see the PowerPoint. Why don't you grab a seat in the front, and we'll call you up in a few moments. Good afternoon. Hello, Michael. How are you? Good. I'm seeing all these people I've had classes with over the years. Just great to reconnect. Well, I'm Reg Litz, and welcome to the James Burns Executive Education Center here at 177 Lombard. And today we're essentially here to have a conversation. I get the Globe and Mail in the morning, and something just in the last couple days, Monday, December 5, knowing this panel was coming, I read an article on Canada's wage gap at record high. The average income of the top 10% of Canadians in 2008 was $103,500, 10 times that of the bottom 10% who had an average income of $10,260, an increase from a ratio of 8 to 1 in the early 1990s. There we go. Basically, we're here today to think about, talk about, reflect on this question. What does Occupy mean to business? And how should business respond? There's a picture there from Portage in Maine with a sign, Occupy Winnipeg, you may be able to see. Let me set a little bit of a stage for this. I was reading a book called Aftershock by Robert Reich. Are any of you familiar with this book? Robert Reich was actually a friend of the late Reg Elcock's, was the Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration, wrote all kinds of books, very interesting. And what caught me in this book, and you can't see it, probably can't see the fine print, but what we have here is the top 1% of income over time. And here we see the growth of the average hourly compensation and productivity. Productivity, compensation, some interesting trends. And what really caught my eye in thinking about this conversation we're going to have in the next hour and a half, we plan to be done before 7, hopefully, was this statement that Robert Reich makes in that book. He says, our history is not quite a pendulum because we never return exactly to where we were before. It's more like a spiral in which we arrive at roughly the same points but at different altitudes and with somewhat different perspectives. Yet each turn of the spiral gives rise to similar questions about the nature and purpose of an economy. How much inequality can be tolerated? When bets go sour and the economy nosedives, who gets bailed out and who's left to fend for themselves? At what point does an economy peril itself politically as large numbers conclude that the game is rigged against them? Most fundamentally, what and who is an economy for? That, in brief, is part of what we're going to be reflecting on this afternoon. And we're basically going to ask, what did Occupy mean? I mean, here we have a picture that I found on the net, and it says that Occupy happened in 951 cities in 82 countries. So one of the questions we want to hear some dialogue on is, what did Occupy mean? Earlier this week, I met with Alex Patterson, who I don't think is here tonight. Alex, are you here? He is a member of the Winnipeg Occupy group. We met at the Second Cup at River and Osborne, talked for about an hour. And I asked him a number of questions. One I asked him from his standpoint was, why did Occupy happen? And he said, we believe the system is being gutted from the inside. Occupy reflects major dissatisfaction with the results of the response to the economic crisis. We weren't aware how bad it was People were willing to suck it up if it benefited them, but now it's the third world suffering plus us. Now it's different. Occupy is a meeting point for a lot of people who haven't been struggling together. Our second question, given that this is sponsored by the IH Asper School of Business, is what does Occupy mean, if anything, for business? And we're going to hear some interesting perspectives a little later this evening about what some of these trends might mean for business. I mean, there's a number of responses we at the Asper School have been undertaking. Hari Bapuji, who was the lead organizer on the panel, where is Hari? There he is. He recently had a blog at Harvard Business Review with one of his colleagues. Occupy Wall Street, what businesses need to know. A number of other things have been happening as well. We've been seeking to facilitate classroom conversations here and there by inviting business researchers and community leaders as special invitees to share their ideas with students. We've been leading public conversations on economic inequality in business through these panel discussions, and we'll be developing an internet forum to sustain dialogue on economic inequality and business among the stakeholders. It'll be finalized following the two panels. We're having two sessions, just in case you weren't aware, today's and tomorrow afternoons, which will be in 343 Drake, and you're most welcome to join us there as well. Format, we're going to run, as I mentioned before, for approximately an hour and a half. We have 4 panelists, and each will be allotted approximately 10 minutes, about 7, 8 to offer their comments, and maybe about 2 or 3 for any clarification-related questions. Following the panelists' talk, we'd like to have a time of general dialogue between you and them. And both panels are being videotaped and will be posted on a specially created website, just for your information. First off, Alan Freeman, our first member of the panel. He's an economist, formerly with the Greater London Authority Economic Analysis Unit. We've asked Alan, as an economist, to reflect on what are the key trends related to economic inequality in the world, particularly the developed world, and what do we know about the effect of economic inequality on human development. Alan's right here in the front row. He'll be joining us at the table in just a moment. Hari Bapuji, I mentioned before, an associate professor specializing in international business at the Asper School. Hari's going to be reflecting on what's the relationship between business and economic inequality, and what should businesses do to manage the effects of inequality, economic inequality on them. Third, Art DeFer, Harvard MBA, CEO of Palliser Furniture, but most importantly, a graduate from the Asper School of Business in 1963. Welcome back. We've asked Art to reflect as a member of Winnipeg's business community how economic inequality affects business and what, if anything, can and should businesses do. After we hear from the three of them, we're going to have a time of conversation. Michael Benarosh, new dean of the Asper School of Business, is going to be listening. And we've asked Michael to offer some concluding thoughts and comments, concerns based on what he's heard thus far. What do you see, what does he see as the key reasons why businesses should or should not address economic inequality? And in addition, what should managers, management researchers, and educators do with respect to this issue? That's our format. Let's see what happens. If I could ask the panelists to take their place. Where's Scott? If I could use this. Why don't you queue up John's or Alan's? Alan's. Well then, Alan, are you good to go?
I am.
Okay. Why don't I give this? Would you like to walk as you?
Yeah. Actually, maybe I can do without the microphone. Can you hear me like this? No. Okay, I can't do without the microphone. Oh, nothing's happening. What do I push? One of these buttons? No, that one.
I sort of live, yeah.
Not sure I've got the hang of this, but we'll see. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, Harry. Thank you, the organisers of this event, and thanks to the Occupy movement. I'm going to proceed, as many economists do, by answering a slightly different question to the one that was asked. But I think that I'm going to do justice to what you wanted, because my basic approach is that we need a comparator. If we want to judge the effect of inequality, we have to say compared to what? Compared to previous stages in history? If so, which ones? The ones in which we were more equal, or the ones which were showing the same degrees of inequality, and that's happened twice in history. In 1922 to 29 it happened, and in 1883 to 87, no, 1863 to 67 it happened, in each time just before a major crisis just like this one. But the main thing I want to talk about is actually things we might be able to learn from the future. So that's why I'm calling it evangelical. I'm, like all economists, claiming special access to the future, but I'm going to base my presentation on an analysis of present trends. Okay, so I'm focusing on what I'll call a possible future. So my comparator will be between the inequality that we now experience and what might be if we chose something different. That's my comparator. So when I'm talking about trends, I'm talking about trends between now and where we might want to go or could go. But this is an ethical vision, and that's why I'm describing it as evangelical, why the title is an ethical space. But I'm going to put forward a very controversial proposition, which is that we are entering a period in which new things can happen that could never happen before, which open what I call an ethical space for business. That is, it is now possible for business to do things that were previously treated as costs, such as caring for its employees, and benefit therefrom. And that's based on absolutely solid economic analysis. So let's go into it, if I can get it. A summary of what I'm going to say. I was responsible for two things while working for two mayors of London: the living wage policy and the policy on creative industries. And I'm going to try and put those two things together. The essential argument is this, that we're entering a period in which the primary productive resource will no longer be things or land or machines, but humans. That's where you find the greatest value added, the greatest growth in value added, what we economists call the marginal increase in productivity, is in those industries that are specializing in humans, which we call the creative industries. I think that's a paradigm for industry as a whole, and I'm going to put that case to you. So that makes possible a way out of crisis, which is based on human development instead of resource exhaustion. This isn't inevitable. We have choice, so ethics informs governance, conduct, law, and contract. I'm going to say a bit about contract, because I think that's important to business. That's the thesis, and I'm going to give a little, snappy description. We have to leave behind the age of machines and enter the age of creation. So that's good, and if I don't finish, you know what I wanted to say. The Living Wage campaign began with this bunch of people here. I haven't got a pointer, but you can see them. This is the London Citizens Network. It was originally a religious group. They got together and they decided they wanted to preserve family values. They set up focus groups, and for 3 years they studied what people felt would be needed if they were going to, maintain their families, and unilaterally everybody said higher wages. That's what people said we need to support our families, our kids, our education, etc. So they, originally out of religious motives, began a community campaign which said that employers should have an ethical duty to pay a wage which is sufficient to support your family and develop your kids and everything that you do. Now, that's very different from the minimum wage. I want to stress this. I haven't got enough time to go into the differences. What I want to talk about is who supported this. Ken Livingstone, the first mayor I worked for, supported it. And Boris Johnson, the second Conservative mayor, supported it. There's the proof. He's sitting there in front of a lot of living wage banners. And here's what the Financial Times said on May the 2nd of this year, that the Conservative mayor of London says the lowest paid in London should earn 40% more than the poorest in the rest of the UK. He's increased the living wage to $13.84. And that's actually the largest increase since I set the formula, which I think the may now be regarding as a bit of a poison pill. But anyway, it's 5% increase in the last year. Okay, so it's inflation busting, and it's a living wage increase. And that's, by the way, the rate at which the Authority of London requires anybody who does work for it to pay its workers. So it's a procurement objective. Now, all that's very interesting. All the major political parties in Britain support it. And one of the questions I want to ask is why? Not only the political parties, but KPMG, one of our largish consultant groups. I think it's one of the top 4 worldwide, along with Anderson and a couple of others. They lead an education and promotional campaign to introduce employers to the living wage and get them signed up for it. They were feted at the, as it says here, by a meeting of the very people we saw standing there with banners, who awarded them Employer of the Year status, and that is taken from their website. If you look at KPMG's website and look at what they are proud of about themselves, you'll see this is number 3. Okay, so they're not mucking about. Why? That's the main thing I want to ask. What is the reason that there has been such a take-up for the living wage in London and in the UK? And the first thing is just technical blah, okay? Conventional economics will tell you that any good is basically going to, the less you pay, the less you ask for, the greater the demand. So that low wages, there's supposed to be a trade-off between wages and employment. So the argument is that if you don't allow employers to pay the lowest possible wage that they can get away with, the consequence will be that people who would otherwise be employed will not get employed, and there will be unemployment. There has been a great controversy about this in economics, and I'm referring you to 2 works there, which are in the references. And I just want to point out technically from the vocabulary of economics what's missing from that account. It's what's called efficiency gains. Efficiency gains are what you get as a result of not having those 4 costs: absenteeism, disloyal employees, people leaving the job and you having to pay to get somebody else, and losing the training skills, losing the training you've imparted, the human development that you've put into your employees. If they just walk out at the end of 6 weeks because their wages are too low, you've lost that, okay? That's what employers said, and we did an evaluation study which estimated the efficiency gains for London to be about 50%. Living wage employers were about, basically recovered 50% of the costs of paying the living wage. Not 100, but 50. There's a proof of this works, which is Henry Ford. Henry Ford, when he introduced the assembly line, more than doubled the wage. Did he lose out? Did what happened to him match conventional economic theory? No. First of all, because he bankrupted all the other car manufacturers in Detroit, because they couldn't afford to pay the wages that he were paying, because he was introducing the latest technology and they didn't have it. Second, he got from their workforce all the most productive, skilled people that he needed to make his lines work. And second, people stopped walking away, which is what they were doing when he was paying the old wage. So efficiency gains are not merely a theoretical fancy, they're well established in economic history. Now, I think that this is not actually an exception to the rule, it's not a blip, it's something whose time has actually come. I just want to check how much time I've got left before I go on.
You have about a minute or 2.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the creative industries. I'm going to give you 4 facts which you can read. The creative industries are now one of the fastest growing and largest sectors in the economy. The assets of the 6 largest content-driven conglomerates is larger than Exxon, for example. And the bottom line here is the key one. The key resource they employ, and I call them a sunrise industry, because I think they're the industry of the future, is labor. It's creative labor, the guys who add the content, who have the skills, who add the value. Proof. This is a figure I got from the music industry. This graph shows the decline in revenues from recorded media. So anything material, you sell tapes, CDs, whatever, industry is slowly losing business. The next graph is going to show the industry's receipts from live performance, that is human organized, human-activated performance. People have not spent less on music, they've stopped spending it on things and started spending it on people. Conclusion, you have to invest in people. And that's why the industries that have implemented the living wage, that have taken an ethical stance towards their employees, are actually the ones that are laughing all the way to the bank. We used to have a vision, which there from my radical days, which have not ended. 1975, you'll see a little picture that we thought that humans were going to be replaced by machines. It hasn't happened. What's actually happened is the productive paradigm has changed. The internet, computers have created a space where people come in. In fact, my definition of creative labor, you heard it first here, is labor that cannot be replaced by a machine. You could go and see robots play instead of the jets. You could. The Japanese will have it fixed in a few years. But will you? No, because what's important is that they are humans. They are part of your society. They're your children. They're your friends. They're your relatives. That means design is king. Content creation is permeating all of industry, not just the creative industries. In fact, my primary controversial conclusion is that the resource of creative labor has impacts way beyond what are called the creative industries. The fastest growing wage sector in London in the last 5 years was security guards. Because security guards no longer take charge of locks and keys, they require intelligence, they interact with people. And that requires those creative skills of deciding on the spot what to do, not being a cog in a machine. So finally, what does this imply? And this is the controversial bit, so I'm going to finish it quickly. The living wage policy worked because it was a public policy. There would not have been the space for people to grow an ethical market if they did not have a guaranteed source of income for that. And that's why the policy was popular, because it was a public policy. On your own as individuals, you can be very influential. The Occupy movement is going to be influential. In business, Harvard students have started taking an ethical oath. Economists are discussing it. It'll be a while before they get around to it. The basic point is it's economically rational as well as morally sound. And I think this is the first time in history, this is where the evangelical stuff comes in, almost millenarian, that we actually can do good by making money. I don't think it's ever quite been good before. But the clincher, the tough thing is you have to get the government to help you. You have to have a public space. Now, public space can mean all kinds of things. We can go into that in questions. It's not just about having a large administrative state apparatus, although I do actually think that may be one of the things we need to get out of this crisis. It's about legislation. It's about the contract. And I'll finish on this thought. If you look at the way that people contract to purchase machines, and you think how much you have to pay in penalties if you damage a machine, okay? Right? If the supplier gives you a machine that doesn't work, they have to fix it. If you damage it, if you yourself misuse it, immediately your entire warranty is null and void. So we live in a contractual legal world that protects things. What if we applied the same criteria to humans? You damage an employee, you're responsible for the whole of the cost to the employee. Only saying the same for employees as we already say for machines. That's the kind of change that I think is possible, but it's the kind of change that I think probably needs courage and vision. And actually, I'm going to really say this, I have to. I think it may be found in Winnipeg.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan. We'll ask Hari Bapuji. Questions? Oh, good point. Is there a question or two for Alan at this time? I actually have one, but I can hold if someone else does. Over there. Yeah.
I'm a little bit behind you on the last part about inclusion, because in ours is here we have things like workers' compensation, short-term non-disability. So how would that fit in?
Okay, you sign a contract to deliver services to the Mayor of London. You sign up to a procurement package. It's green, it's anti-discrimination, it's employees' rights, and it's minimum wage, it's living wage paying, okay? You could extend that. In my opinion, you should. I think the protection of the employee is absolutely inadequate in Britain. One of the things that has struck me, although if I'm able to be enlightened, I'd be very pleased, is just how little legal protection employees in Canada actually have compared with what I find in London. So what we're talking about is the civil right of the employee to say that, you know, I need time off for parental care, I need time off for education, I need support to be educated, to educate my kids. I need my employer to help me be make it possible for me to be a citizen, and a citizen who is making a growing contribution to the economy. I don't find that, and so I'm saying that that's what should be there. I don't know if that answers your question.
Is there another question?
Let me throw this out, maybe for
Charles?
maybe for later rather than now.
Sure.
But if Henry Ford could do it, why do you need the government?
Because it was only Henry Ford. You need a government so everybody does it.
We may revisit that a little later in the afternoon. Hari, over to you.
Hello, everyone. We do talk about outsourcing and all that kind of stuff. Scott has found a way how you can never outsource things. Only he knows how things work here. So your job is always secure. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why businesses should care about economic inequality. That's what I have titled my presentation as. As a researcher, I've been interested in issues that arise in the organization or which have basis in the organizations but have larger implications on the society. Some of you may have seen my earlier research on product safety crisis and China. Recently, I have started taking interest in global financial crisis. A couple of my colleagues and we have written a few research articles. We examined the responses of business leaders, CEOs and stakeholders to the global financial crisis. In our examination, what we found was that despite the enormity of the crisis, there were hardly any calls for change. The CEOs and stakeholders were mostly saying, things are fine, we'll maintain status quo. They were not making any changes to the systems or organizational practices. So that was one thing that was surprising, because it was one of the biggest things that has happened in our lifetimes, and people are not talking about any changes. And second thing that we noted was that the entire discourse is dominated by those whom we can call as elites. The common man perspective was completely absent. What we see is that comments made by academics, regulators, and business leaders and all those, but they never ask anything about consumers, okay, like people who have lost jobs. So that is one thing that was also very noteworthy. What we see as a result of the global financial crisis is that the economic inequality has increased, but there has been relatively a lot of calm in North America. In contrast, in Europe, we have seen riots and a lot of uproar. So we were always wondering, for about 2 years, we were wondering, why is that nobody talking about it? Why is there such relative calm in North America? And then came Occupy Wall Street and then turned into Occupy Everything. You have seen the number of countries where it has spread to. So then we started looking at, what are the business implications of it? So one thing that surprised us again was that although businesses have some role to play in it, if not the central role, business community or business academics have been largely unresponsive. They were not saying much. So we thought, okay, let's talk about it. So I'm not giving any figures because the figures keep changing depending on who is putting them out and all. But by now, one thing has been clearly mentioned, clearly highlighted, clearly drove home by Occupy movement is the income and wealth distribution. As you can see, those who are at the top 1% make a lot of dollars, and then those who are at the next 19% make roughly as much, and then those who are at the bottom, like that's about 80% of us, they make very little. So if you look at this, this looks fine, right? Does it look fine? Does it look stable? You know, it's a pyramid, so it must be stable, right? So that's why what I thought was, let's visualize it differently. It is not, when something is like this, it is not a pyramid anymore. It's an inverted pyramid, right? I really want us to take a moment to internalize this. It's not a pyramid anymore. It's not like this. It is an inverted pyramid. So what happens when a pyramid is inverted? Is it stable? It's not going to be stable, right? So how can you make it stable? Spin it. If you spin it, what happens? Stable for a short period of time, and you can tilt it. You can turn it completely, but there's going to be a lot of unrest, right? So what normally happens, right, is that when the pyramid is inverted, there are attempts to stabilize it, right? So the engineer in me tells that you can have some structures, supporting structures that would keep it in place. These supporting structures are called guard labor by economist Samuel Bowles. What he says is that to keep the system in place, we create a lot of roles which could be prisons, could be policing and monitoring roles, security roles, all these roles which do not add anything productive but just maintain the system in place. Now what happens if you are an organization in that society? What happens? Just think about it. You're next to the pyramid, which is not really stable, right? What you do is you try to cover yourself. You try to protect yourself by fortifying your core. So that is one that you can do. The other thing that you can do is that you can contribute to the stability of the inverted pyramid through various means. What are those? You can do that through taxes. So we have seen earlier that it is the guard labor which provides the largest supporting structures. So the other way is that the organizations can help this system to be in place by paying taxes and through lobbying so that regulations and policies keep the system in place as it is. This is the next dilemma, right? You can do that. But what if the organization itself is unequal? So you have a much larger problem. So where you have the top management or the top 10% of the workforce taking a large amount of the income. So what happens then? You have not only supporting structures that you have to give to the society, and you have to protect your organization by fortifying it, but also you must have your own support structures. But finally, organizations are within the society. So no matter how much support you would give, no matter how many supporting structures you create for the society, no matter how much you do, if the entire system is not stable, you are not going to be stable. Sometime or the other, you are going to run into problems. So what are those problems? These are the problems that arise because of human development suffering due to inequality. Richard Wilkinson has talked about or has shown through a number of studies how countries that are highly unequal have low human development. That is reflected in a number of things: life expectancy, teenage pregnancies, violence, crime rates, all that. But there are two things that I would like to take up for discussion. One is that those societies, the people in those societies tend to have lower skills, particularly math and literacy scores. And second is that those are the people who are also likely to have less trust in the system, less trust, they are likely to be less trusting of others. And then also the opportunities for social mobility are not very high. He not only showed this between countries, but also between states within a country. So the states where the inequality is high, human development is low. The states where inequality is low, human development is high. So what comes up with this is that level of inequality or average does not matter. What matters is the spread, how much inequality is there. So if you take this forward, the people who are low on human development, they enter organizations, right? We ultimately get our employees from the society. So they enter organizations. So what happens? We have high human resource costs as a result of low human development. First of all, you have few skilled personnel, so you are competing for those skilled people, so you pay more. So that is one. Second is that if you don't get them, you may have to hire people with low skills. And when you hire people with low skills, then you would invest in training and development. So that is one cost. The second is similar to the guard labor, where you're trying to keep things in place. There will be high supervision costs when there is high inequality. So because these people don't trust, you cannot really form teams. So you cannot form a lot of teams, so you have more supervisors. And also there is going to be low mobility, like there are not many opportunities for you to move up. So these employees are more likely to have low motivation and be very vengeful. And also as a result of low motivation, they are likely to be low on productivity. And finally, you are also likely to have lower revenues, overall, lower revenues, because you are going to have you're overall likely to have lower revenues because there is not much movement of people up. People are not moving up on the pyramid. So because of the inequality, you have a large population which is just making do. So the consumption type differs. So the middle class shrinks. As a result, your revenues will be lower. So how can you fix this? So there are two things to do. One is the internal inequality, that is organizational inequality, the smaller pyramid that we see. So one is that you have to make sure that the pay is equitably distributed. Pay equity is high in organizations. One example that comes to mind is the Costco, where the CEO's pay is less than 10 times that of the average worker pay. Now, in an industry like in a retail industry where the big box retailers have there have been so many stories about employee abuse, low wage, and all that kind of stuff. Costco is an industry leader. It does generate industry leading returns. And more importantly, one measure of the sabotage is what they call as shrinkage in the retail industry. Shrinkage is a euphemism for the theft by the employees. Costco's theft by the employees or shrinkage is 10% of the industry average. So you can see benefits coming directly from there. So that is one. And second is that you have to invest more in training and development so that you generate opportunities for employees to move up and also be able to trust others. So the second thing that we need to do is to manage the external inequality, that is the inequality in the society. So how can you do? You can create a division that would track the trends in inequity in the society and then make some kind of recommendations or create programs to manage that. This is not something that has happened so far, but there are examples that we can take, like Pepsi, for example, right? Pepsi has been criticized for selling sugar drinks to people and making them obese and unhealthy. So what they did was they hired people who worked earlier for World Health Organization, Mayo Clinic, and a lot of scientists they've hired, and created a division whose mandate is to develop products that are healthier. So one product that they have developed is Trop 50. We all know the Tropicon orange juice, right? Trop 50 is something that has half the calories of the regular orange juice, Tropicon. Now this brand has now reached to be a $100 million brand. So it is that you can create new products and services and make money. And another thing that you can do is to provide access to to communities and groups in the society through better education or through skill development. One example that comes to mind is Tata Group in India. A lot of companies in India, in fact, do focus on community development. The reason why I'm giving an Indian example is that countries like India have seen high levels of inequality. Inequality is something that we are talking about now. Of course, it has been there in this part of the world before, but it is becoming more and more prominent now. But in countries like India, the inequality has always been high. So how did companies manage that? If you look at Tata, one of the most successful companies, Tata Group they do everything from tea to hotels, like they do software, they are into everything. But they also do a lot of community development through their trust. They put a lot of their profits back into the society in terms of education. They have set up educational institutions, they have set up hospitals, and they have set up research institutes. So in general, focusing on community development and infrastructure development for the places where they operate. So that is another thing that you can do. So to conclude, we have always thought that economic inequality is good for business because it increases aspiration and growth. So when there is some amount of inequality, it does increase aspiration in people. So you want to move up, right? So you create new products and services, so it is good for businesses. But businesses, if they have a narrow focus on the top management or only shareholders or short-term profits, then they can increase economic inequality, as we have seen before. So the top two loops are kind of visible. Like you can see like very clearly. We have all talked about it. But what we see is that economic inequality can actually hurt businesses because of guard labor that we talked about and also low human development. To counter that, what you need to do is to create another loop that goes back from business to the economic inequality, which should try to decrease economic inequality through internal equity, skill development, and opportunity generation. So what we need is a broader systems thinking where you're not only looking at the short term or the direct loops, but also and visible loops, but also the invisible loops and a longer term orientation. So with that, I conclude.
Thank you very much, Hari.
I also have a thank you, sir. Thank you.
As I was listening to Hari talk about lower skills, less trust in the system, a Midas Muffler commercial I remember watching back in the 80s came to mind. You can pay me now or you can pay me later. You know, kind of interesting to reflect the nature of the system. Let's see if there's a question or two for Hari before we move on to our next commentator. Any questions for Hari? Please.
At the very end of the presentation, you're saying that we can decrease the economic inequality by shareholding, different, more so kind of, I don't know, kind of positive things. What do you think about the states is thinking about taxing the higher incomes? What do you think of that?
On those things, I would probably, I think our economists are better equipped to handle that. My focus is looking at what businesses can do. Okay, public policy implications are there. Yes, definitely governments can do a lot more. There are a number of economists who talked about how you create, equity in the society. So one is that you can definitely do that through taxation. Yes, but I'm not an expert to comment on that. Yes.
There's a question right behind you.
So some of your example of what businesses can do to counteract the costs of inequality
Um, so I think what we're seeing is that firstly, depending on exports is a relatively new thing for India. Okay, so Tata Group and a number of other companies which were there for a long time, which have been there for a long time, their focus was on the domestic market. Exports is a recent one. When I say recent, it's about 20 plus years. So that tells you how old I am. So it's about 2 decades old phenomena that India is focusing on exports. But the same examples you would find in North America as well. I'm sure, like some of you would know about the steel cities that we have seen in North America, where the entire city is based on a particular factory or a particular manufacturing sector. So the idea is that these businesses do try to develop those communities, take up the whole community, not simply looking at we are here, we pay you the wage and you work for us, but trying to develop the community in terms of providing schools, developing schools, or setting up infrastructure and hospitals, things like that. So there are cases like that that we see. There are many examples like that even in this part of the world as well. Yes.
I'm going to, in the interest of time,
Yes.
hold the questions at this point, but we would like to come back to you a little later. Thank you very much, Hari. I'd now like to call on Art DeFair for his thoughts.
I noticed that Reg chose to position me between 4 professors over here, and so I'm not quite sure what he's expecting to be different, but we'll find out.
Welcome to the club. Yeah.
As he mentioned, I graduated at least from Winnipeg in the early 60s, mid 60s, and then went to a couple of more universities in the States. And so I spent my time in the U.S. during that very interesting period. My kids who graduated a generation later are very jealous because they grew up at a time when nothing was happening in their view. And I was involved in, as I said, anything that moved, I was marching with it. And I'm still a Nexus poster child, and that I never get, my card never seems to arrive. But it's true. Even Janet Napolitano has dealt with it. Can't figure it out. But let me start with a story. I appreciated Alan Freeman's talking about this being an ethical question and wasn't part of what I was going to say, but I think it's very important because I actually do view the current question that we have, or the current issue, as having a very strong moral dimension to it. And it's not a religious question. I just think, let me explain in a moment. In 1989, my family's Russian Mennonite, so comes from back there. In 1989, I met the number 2 diplomat from the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. And we became friends at some events, and I told him my story. And he says, Art, you have to go back to the Soviet Union. And I said, why? I did nothing for my family. A lot of them were killed there. I don't owe them anything. He says, forget that stuff. The people there didn't cause the problem. It's the system. Don't blame the current people. But he said, you go back because you have something to offer. I said, tell me. He says, well, he says, this was 1989, 2.5 years before the coup that ended communism. He said, we will, and he was head of the Institute of Canadian American Studies, so he knew the North American system well. He said, we will, sometime in the not distant future, attempt a market system, and we will fail. And he said, why will we fail? He says, 2 reasons. He says, one is after 70 years, we have no idea how to be entrepreneurs anymore, and people like yourself have to come back and begin to teach us that. We don't need the GMs and IBMs of the world. They're like our oligarchs. They'll be the same, or our big companies. But he said the second thing was very interesting. He said he knew my Christian background. He says, after 70 years and what communism has done, said in the West, when you people do a deal, he said, this is 1989, that's why I say it's very important. He says, when you meet and do a transaction, you shake hands with somebody, you have a high expectation that the other person will follow through, go back the next day and sign the papers or pay the bill and follow through. And the comment he made, he says, many of you may not go to the church or the synagogue anymore, but your parents did, and there's enough memory that you in fact behave that way. So in the Soviet Union, that memory is gone. And when the moment you've got the money, the deal is done. And I've experienced that. I went and worked there. I actually went back to the Soviet Union in that same year and organized 4 national conferences on business and ethics. And 3 of them in communist times, in Communist Party buildings with Lenin or Marx looking over my shoulder on a big painting. And obviously I wasn't very successful. But it was a very, very interesting time. And when you look fast forward now to what's happening today, and we look fast forward to Russia, where finally after 20 years, the people are saying enough, even with Putin. They're saying, it didn't work. Even the political system didn't work, and the market system certainly hasn't worked there as well. So I think it's very important that now you look at our own situation, and if you look at the kind of words that people are using about our financial crisis or the crisis of the last couple of years, they don't use things like that regulation failed. They're talking about bankers' greed. Greed is a moral term. That's not a rules a regulatory term. When we talk about but you look at what's happening in terms of the taxation debates in the U.S., and you're talking about a lot of the things that have dealt with the inability to confront the inequality question as a fundamental question of society is really a moral question, many of these things. So my view is, I know Mark Carney reasonably well. I sent him a note, good luck, I says, because what you're dealing with is, and what you're really saying is that he's supposed to deal with a regulatory framework to replace what used to be dealt with substantially with internal discipline and a certain moral understanding. So we're saying that in the North Mediterranean countries and in other places in the world, there's an absence of any ethical understanding. Now we're supposed to have enough regulations to replace that. We used to have it in places like China because they have what's called discipline, because they punish you if you don't. And when that discipline disappears, watch out. In China, I've spent a lot of time there as well, and I'm very concerned about that side as well. That wasn't what I was going to say, but I think I appreciate that Alan's introduction. But I do think that there is fundamentally that we're dealing with issues which have an ethical underpinning to them, because the market system does require a certain level of trust. And if that level of trust and understanding disappears, you've got a problem. So the questions that I was going to speak to is, there's a couple of what I have to switch. I just got cataract surgery done. I got to switch from not wearing glasses to wearing glasses. So I'm getting used to it. But what are some of the big questions? And one of the questions, do we really believe that what I call as current economic and social issues call for a major realignment of our economy, politics, or social structures? If they do, then how is that going to happen? If they don't, then we have a different question, but something went wrong. On the Occupy question, is the Occupy movement a flavor of the month, or does it suggest that there's fire in the volcano and something's going to happen eventually? Clearly, it hasn't ignited the world this time. But is it making a statement, or is it something that we'll forget about next year? I look at my own business. I said, does it matter if your own business is perceived as part of the problem or part of the solution? I spoke with a colleague the other day who's friend who's a billionaire decided to sell their yacht. They're afraid to be people who own a very large yacht. And they said, maybe we shouldn't have that. Something has changed. And then I think the big question may come to an end is the kind of thing that's happened the last couple of years, is it the kind of issue that can invite a movement which can create productive change? And we may come back to later. I think the issues are driving this outburst are fairly well known. So they were partially stated, but let me repeat them again because they weren't stated in a complete form. First, the growing inequality, which was mentioned, so I won't say anything more on that. But the question I will ask, is there a tipping point when it becomes unsustainable in our society? Now, there are societies that are very unequal, but a lot of that then depends, I do a lot of work in Mexico, depends on the political structure. Some political structures can handle a lot more inequality. We still have a fair degree of noisy democracy, and in that kind of how much inequality can you sustain? The other one is the financial system. I think there's a widespread view, even among people who would be normally sympathetic to it, that it's out of control. I've been observing for a number of years that the financial system in North America has taken about 40% of the profits for most of the last decade. And if you look at their contribution towards society, what they actually produce, there's a real question, is that worth 40% of the income of society? And a lot of people would say no. The second part I already mentioned, there's an absence of internal discipline or self-control, which then comes out as the word greed. Third one we haven't talked about is the politics itself. And I think that if the political system was sound, you could maybe deal with these questions. But when the political system has been almost completely corrupted by money and maybe some other issues, structural issues, then how do you in fact correct other parts of the system? And I think many people are losing faith in this. They're not only losing faith in the economic system, but probably even more so in the political system. And I think countries are different, but certainly we all have watched TV in the process, and the US system has become not only dysfunctional, I call it structurally dysfunctional, and that's a bigger problem. An interesting one is global competition. We often, and I would say that global competition, while I think we all want the world to become more complex, it isn't a neutral factor, and that's because there's a couple of reasons. One is that it creates pressures which are sometimes artificial for a period of time, and they can be I don't know if they're destructive or whatever it is. Maybe the question that I will leave that if Reg wants to deal with is one of the things that if you get back to the Occupy movement, I wanted to spend a moment on that, is if you've got all these disruptive or these dysfunctional forces in the economy, in the financial system, the political system, are these the kind of issues that can create a counterbalancing movement? I think the Occupy movement speaks to, like they said, we have lots of things we're critical of, but can you have a movement that can actually change that if you don't have a proper focus? As I said, I grew up in the 60s, and probably what radicalized me more than anything was the civil rights movement, and I consider myself very fortunate to have been around at that time, because I think it gives a person a perspective that for life. I was actually part of the Selma Montgomery March, which is not that many people were. But it certainly radicalized me in a way that makes me sensitive to other kind of issues. But the question, I think the real issue is that the problems are so disparate when you talk about a political system and you talk about a financial regulation and you talk about economic factors. How do you put them into something which creates a movement which actually can say, what change do you need? In the civil rights movement, we had a very clear idea what the outcome was. And if you had certain kind of outcomes and laws and access to schools, then you had got what you had wanted in the problem, or at least moving in the right direction. In this thing, there are so many different issues that I don't think, if you don't have a singular outcome that is right, then it's very hard to get a movement going, because they can talk about the 1%. The point is, a lot of the people in the next 30, 40% feel okay about the system, are doing okay. It isn't only the 1% doing good. So I think that the Occupy movement is saying there's something wrong, but what I'm wondering is if with that kind of a range of issues, it's possible to get a movement together which actually speak to its solutions. And that worries me, because I think we actually have to solve some problems.
Thank you very much. Now, the handheld microphone is with Hari. And where is Scott? Scott is coming right back. I'm going to ask Scott if he would take the microphone, and let's first see if there's a question or two for Art, and then we'll move to the overall panel. I see a hand right there, Scott. Woman in the second row.
Thanks. I appreciated what you had to say about the differences between the civil rights movement and the Occupy movement. I think that's very true, that, and maybe part of the reason why it's such a challenge now is that there's an awareness that simply seeking passage of a few laws isn't going to solve the problem. I'm wondering if you see the solution as being a restoration of this sense of moral self-control, absence of greed that you were speaking of, or whether the problem is bigger and a need to, in some sort of way, transform an economic system that actively rewards greed.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the idea that it will be based on, again, we're assuming that morality was there before. I mean, something was there before, at least, although there were other periods of inequality as well. But I think the capitalist system, the market system itself, did seem to have some better underpinnings than it has right now, and it was also different maybe at an earlier stage. I don't expect we're going to use we're going to have an evangelistic revival of some kind, which is going to result in morality. We're going to have to find our way in a different way. And so probably this is going to have to come. I mean, well, what's happening in Europe right now? What's happening in Europe right now is Angela Merkel simply saying that for no particular moral reason, said if a German works till 67, they're not going to subsidize a Greek pension at 55. Okay, so you have to have you have to kind of have an understanding of that that we all have to, in a sense, there are some behavior patterns which have to be defended and put in place, which allow the system to work. And I think the idea that the system, a system that can work without regulation, which was the, let's say, the Republican mantra the last 20, 30 years, I think is in relatively disrepute. And it's got nothing to do whether it's Republican or Democrat. I think that we have to move off that agenda and simply saying that we need, we clearly need leadership at the top, which creates an understanding. And it's hard to, because you don't want to put the kind of say, well, those people who have lots of regulation, a lot of government is the answer. But clearly we need a consensus about what works, and somebody has to have the leadership to talk about that. Right now it's not out there.
Let's go to the second row, please. The microphone is coming right behind you. There we go.
There's just been talk about how when it comes to change in the way people are being paid, it's also a change in the way we value our employees and also the culture of the company and the organization as a whole. And to do that, there would have to be some changes in the way the CEOs and the leaders and executives view what their work is worth. So if we're going to change that the difference in the ratio as how the wages are being paid and the executives and how they're paid, would that be a deterrent as to how the work of the leaders, or if they would leave, how would companies retain expertise and leadership that they would want in a good organization? How would we control that when it comes to trying to figure out the balance?
Well, I think one of the important things is to realize that even within our Western or fully developed societies, clearly some societies have answered that question differently. I mean, so some of the economists may have better stats than I have, but I mean, the statistics in the European CEO relative to their average income is very different. My income, I happen to try to practice what I preach. My income is between 10 and 12 times my average production worker's income, and I simply figure it's enough. And, you know, so it's my own choice. I own the company, so it's easier to do. But no, but I'm still saying it's a point of view. But I think clearly something happened in the last 20, 30 years in North America which has gotten on the wrong track. It hasn't happened as completely in Europe. Like I said, it's not one thing. It's many different things. It's the lack of regulation banking. It's the CEO pay. There's a whole bunch of things when added together eventually have caused a breakdown, reached the crisis point.
Another question right in the back. Is that Calvin?
Yeah.
Please.
Hi. Talking about the difference between North America and Europe, and some of the thoughts that are going through my head that I'd be curious to get your comment on. Some of the changes, especially in the last 40 years, you've got, for example, in the wealthy segment of society, especially in American society, a lot of social goods that people require, education, security, healthcare, you can obtain on a private basis, live in a gated community, and so you no longer have need for the public services, so you have less of a vested interest in the quality of those services, which affect a very broad segment of society. And then the other thought that enters my mind is land use planning in the last 40 years has had a lot of segregation of our uses. So mixes of income types and mixes of our uses on a daily basis are changing so that a wealthy person can live in a wealthy, affluent neighborhood, jump into their single-use automobile, drive directly to their place of employment, and never interact with those of lesser means. And I wonder if you'd have any commentary on how this might play into the moral question, if that starts eroding the moral connection that we have with each other in society.
Well, let me give one answer, and others may want to answer that. So those of you who live in Winnipeg, or I assume most of you do, some of you may have been to Pritchard Farm Properties. That was developed by myself, and that was developed because the city planners said that if you're rich, you should move to Tuxedo, and otherwise it's a blue-collar area in the Northeast. My father wanted to stay where their grandkids were, so we started building stuff there. But it's really the idea of Pritchard Farm Properties is I had people come to me at the time and want to take some bays on that and create little gated communities in there. Like we'll take 10, 20 lots and put a gate on, and I wouldn't sell it to anybody who wanted to put a gate in. In fact, if you walk along the creek, you'll notice that there's not a single fence along 4 kilometers of creeks. And the reason for that is because written in the regulations, you can put a metal dog fence in there that you can look through, but if you want to live on the creek, you're completely visible to the community, so that the idea if you walk along the creek, your neighbor can see you and talk to you and vice versa. If you don't want that, then don't buy a house on the creek. So the whole idea is become a very strong community. It was built with a community in mind. I just went to us today with the city planners. We're trying in the Northeast to develop a community of 3,000 people on one of the few vacant empty pieces over there. Again, completely integrated toward a center built around transit. Yes, I think the nature of community has a lot to do with it, and it begins with planning, and it also begins with will.
Michael, could I ask you for your thoughts?
Sure. What Reg didn't tell you is what I really leaned over to him and said is, how long can you keep a dean quiet? You know, your comments are extremely well taken, and I just want to put that in a little context. I'm actually an economist, an international trade economist who focused on development, and remember teaching my students theories and views that globalization or expanded international trade would in fact equalize wages across countries and would in fact lead to that, and use the same examples of Japan and Korea that you use right there. And what we've experienced is that that's not happening, certainly not happening the way we drew it on the blackboard. And so my students are probably sitting around and going, see, Professor Benarush was right when he said reality screws up my theories. I wanted to put a little context on some of this and bring together a whole bunch of points, because people have made really, really good points. And I want to play economist. I want to put on my economist hat and tell you a little bit about the problem of the growing income gap. Something that began to be noticed by economists in the 1980s and really puzzled us because we were having all this productivity and technological improvement. We were having expanded international trade across the world. And our expectation was that, in fact, that was going to lead to a decline in the income gap because it was going to benefit those lower skills to improve productivity, that productivity was going to increase and improve across the board, not just in selected parts of the population. And that with international trade and expanded economic development and open markets, that we would export essentially our technological improvements, our way of living in a sense in terms of our standard of living to the third world, and that would increase productivity and incomes in those parts of the world, and we would become more equalized. And while there's pockets of where that's happened, overall what we've experienced, interestingly, is that globalization, if we want to call it that, has in fact caused income gaps to rise in both developed and less developed countries at the same time. So you're now seeing countries that we expected income gaps to fall, increasing at the same time across. And so this really puzzled us as economists. And so there's been a fair bit of study on this, and most economists lean towards looking at technology and the role of technology driving income gaps across countries and within countries. Now, why do I say this? I say this because I'm supposed to wrap this up a little bit and talk about potential solutions or things that I think we could start looking at. And I don't think you can do that unless you drill down and say, what is really causing these gaps, this to happen? And so what we've really observed is that a lot of the technology is skill biased, so that the skills, the higher skilled people are really taking much more advantage of that technology than the lower skill. In fact, at the lower skill level, it's caused jobs to disappear, which were medium or regularly good paying jobs at one time. and those jobs have been replaced with higher skill jobs. Not only that, productivity improvements and technology improvements have reduced the number of manufacturing workers that we need globally. So it's not just about outsourcing, it's about the fact that we have fewer of those middle income jobs that we had at one point. And so what we observe really is the middle class starting to disappear in a way, and that incomes at the bottom are not increasing. So I know we focus on the CEO's salaries, and as economists, I tend to look at it a little more globally. So, you know, my wife always tells me I'm naive and I'm not really drilling down far enough. But the point is that the CEO's salaries going out of whack really is, you know, in the context of lower income salaries not rising, really looks extreme. And so if you look at data, doesn't matter where you look at it, you're not seeing the lower income levels salaries starting to increase. And so that's having a real negative impact on the economy. And in fact, you know, it starts to get to the point where if you start looking at the effects of the financial crisis, and again, you move that away and say, okay, maybe that's a cycle, I don't know. But if you look away, what are the longer term impacts of that? Well, the longer term impacts is that we've redistributed income, significant amount of income, from people who had very high marginal propensity to consume to people who have much lower marginal propensities to consume. And so an effect on businesses is that we will start to see lower demand, you know, over time. And this is critical because the market economy is driven by demand. And so if we start to redistribute income in a way that has a negative impact on demand, that will start to really have an effect on future growth rates, which are going to slow down, which is not going to make this situation any easier. The interesting thing about globalization is it's actually increased the ability of the highest income earners to command much higher compensation. Roger Martin, the dean at the business school at U of T, Rodman, has written quite a bit about this. And there's been much greater demand for high-wage jobs in a sense, but there's just not that many being created. It's not proportional to the number of people in the labor force that we've needed. So I think that if you look at those two as an economist, look at globalization's effect, even though the pure effect of expanded international trade, there's very little empirical evidence which says that in and of itself has caused rising wage gap. You know, as a trade economist, I thought I could explain it that way because that seems to be an important fact, but it seems other factors around globalization. All of this is taking place at a time where we're really looking at governments and have been looking at governments to become smaller. So it's interesting to note in the recent OECD study that came out, they said that, you know, it used to be that 70% of the gap of income differentials was offset by government benefits and taxes, and now that's down to 40%. And that's, in fact, what we would expect when you see governments pulling back, but also when you see tax structures starting to shift towards necessarily wanting to benefit those that we see as job creators, right? And the reality shows that it hasn't been a one-to-one trade-off. That's why deficits in many times are growing, because we haven't created that kind of income that we had expected. And so, you know, so we have this system that kind of took a life of its own. And you know, as an economist, I don't want to talk about, you know, whether this was, you know, somebody sat there and planned it, but the fact is that it took this life of its own. And productivity started to really gain momentum, and globalization expanded trade. And over time, this rising wage gap starts to expand. And now we're in a system where governments are cutting back, and really, in many ways, they added fuel to that fire, because now the social safety net became a lot weaker. And so it has become a very big challenge on how to deal with this. So where do we go from here? You know, I still do believe in the market economy. I still do believe that it's the best system that we have. But I think that we have to begin to really focus in on these issues as becoming really important and part of our business plan, and not to just think about short-term profits. right? If we can think of the biggest problem of this crisis has been the fact that short-term profits motivated behavior. We need to move away from short-term profits, and we do need to think about the larger social impact. And so the tax system has to be reformed in many ways so that it can start to serve its original purpose. I mean, when you go back to Adam Smith, you know, if you look at the role of government is really to come in and help when the market doesn't take care of things. And I think that this still remains an important part. And I think the benefit system has to be reformed. And I think the U.S. is the classic case of this, right? They don't have a debt problem. They have a tax problem. And that is that they're not taxing enough, or that their system has so many loopholes that they can't raise the amount of revenue. They're more than wealthy enough to withstand and be able to afford the level of government spending that they have, which is on a per capita basis lower than all of us, and we seem to be able to do it. I think that access to employment is critical, and I think we have to think about it as a strategy to promote economic growth. And again, picking up on points which have been said today, it's not just about having a job, but it's really about having a job that pays you well enough to not be poor, right? And so there's a lot of things that go along with that, and you drill down then to the business enterprise and say, from the business perspective, how do we create an environment that really has those in the social fabric and the fabric of the organization? Human capital in the workforce, right? And we heard it from many people here today. Human capital has become the critical factor in our workforce. And so if we're going to solve the problem, if we're going to start to increase incomes at the lower level, then we've got to raise the level of human capital in society as a whole. And so that requires policies to promote skill and promote the improvement of skills. I think Germany is a great example of the fact that that doesn't necessarily mean governments coming in and having more educational programs, even though I think government should spend more on universities, but that's beside the point. Right. I think that, you know, you can do this in the workplace, but the point is that there's a commitment to raise the skill level of all of your employees as a strategy, as a business strategy to remain competitive in the marketplace, rather than the view of trying to lower your labor costs all the time. It's really about raising your labor productivity. We do a terrible job of this in Canada, right? We rely on others to innovate, and then we come in and try to implement them. And so, I think that there is a sense of trying to change that focus to deal with the human capital issues, and that's ultimately what it comes down to. It's been an unequal distribution of the way that technology in many ways has been used in society. I'm not sure if, I know that when you read a lot of the writing around here, a lot of this is unexpected in terms of how we thought theoretically the world was going to evolve. But the reality is that we're here, and so now it's a matter of refocusing and really thinking about strategies that will increase the incomes across the board. And I think it's a strategy to maintain higher economic growth, or at least more stable and higher employment levels, and obviously, a safer world, because, we know the positive impacts of that. So I'll stop there.
We've heard about China a couple times tonight. Let me mention my favorite Chinese proverb of all time. The wisest man sees the furthest ahead. Michael, what do you see ahead if we don't pay attention to these human capital issues?
Well, again, I see this, I see us moving to a world where we're really going to look at slower economic growth, because I think that is part of the equation. There's some other factors there which I don't have time to get into today. I think we're going to see more political unrest as a result of that, and I think we're going to see more instability, and our ability to deal with instability is I think going to get worse. The case of Europe right now, where they run into a debt problem in a couple of countries, which, if you look at the value of the debt in Greece relative to other countries, it's really a drop in the bucket. And it's the same mentality that's kind of got us into this. If we were to see Greece and the problems they've gotten into, and we would look at first solving the short-term solution and then looking at a long-term solution. But what we've done is we've mixed the long-term with the short-term. So we've asked Greece to balance their budget today, which is virtually impossible, in order to move forward, because we've mixed up the short and the long. And so then you start to run into really major problems. Now, you know, we could have easily gone in right away and solved the problem by buying up Greek debt to keep the interest rate low for Greece so they can afford while they restructure. And they were willing to restructure, but we didn't do that. And so what happens when we don't solve these problems is they come back to bite us even worse. So now you've got Italy, which is a rich country, which should be able to afford to pay their debt. And you've got Spain, which isn't even that indebted. Maybe it had a bad deficit a couple of years. Now it starts to snowball. Now you're talking about banks. And so I think the whole world system, the globalization has tied us all together. And so the housing market in the U.S. can have a negative impact on the entire world now. And if we think about it in that context, and you think about the fact that if we remain moving on this line, where such a large proportion of our population can't afford to live and is not spending, then you think about that no longer being, no longer just hitting one or two countries, but spreading across the world. So I really think that we have to start thinking about these things more globally, and the major leaders of the world have to take the responsibility to set the stage for trying to solve these problems.
Thank you. Yes. We had originally said we were going to go until 7 o'clock. Scott, do we have time for a couple more questions, and then we will draw this to a close? Would anyone like to respond to anything they've heard tonight? Please. The microphone is...
Thank you. I guess it's kind of for all of you. We've had a lot of talk about, raising wages at the bottom and living wages, and Harry talked about I really like the pyramid metaphor, by the way. This unstable pyramid, inverted pyramid that we have, and how taxes and wages could help stabilize this. But another thing that Harry talked about was these guard jobs at an attempt of stabilizing the system as is. And, I like the idea of living wages and raising everyone above the point so that we can reduce crime and reduce theft and things. But it seems like our leaders don't necessarily believe in that theory, because we see a lot of talk about increasing all these guard jobs, increasing policing and prisons and things like that. And I'm just wondering, how should businesses be approaching that, with our leaders going sort of the other direction than what we're talking about today?
How do we remain creative in an increasingly guard-infested society?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So I think that part of it is that you have to look at the role of government in trying to move us forward in medium and long term. And that the role of government is not always to come in and spend a whole bunch of money, right? But to put in place, to help businesses move forward in a particular way. I actually believe strongly that one of the things that we have to start doing, and I said it already, is really a human capital, raising the level of human capital, and thinking of productivity and thinking of innovation as the way we really drive incomes to grow. And I think where the government can play a role is to really try and set policy and set agendas to create an innovating society. And I don't think we have that right now in Canada. Certainly the US, there's other issues in the United States. But the Europeans for a long time have done that. And they've created a generally very high standard of living. They've kind of maybe went a little too far in certain directions other ways, and so that's created some problems. But I think that the way we create living wages is really to try and create the kinds of jobs that pay those higher incomes. And to create those kinds of jobs, we need to really have the human capital to drive that. And we're in some sense a step away. And so we do get into the struggle of then trying to keep low-paying jobs in Canada and attracting those and protecting them, because we haven't put in place, and it's not going to happen overnight, right? We can't do that. We can't change that overnight. This is a kind of medium, long-term approach, but I think we need to start putting that in place in order to deal with those kinds of problems.
We'll take one more question right in the back row. You, sir?
This is for Mr. DeFer. You own your company, and a lot of people are saying one of the causes of this crisis is that we have CEOs and executives their ultimate goal is to provide profit to the shareholder. Because you don't have shareholders, do you feel any pressure from anything else that would cause the imbalances that are currently going on?
Well, I mean, I'm a shareholder, so. No, I think the reality is that I can certainly, and I can make some different choices. But what happened, for example, in 07 and 08, when the world changed, I can be doing whatever I like, but quite literally the banks walked from our industry. And I actually had the choice of, although I was meeting all my requirements, I had the Bank of America at the time. And this isn't generally known, but the Bank of America was having its own problems, and I realized how they were treating myself. And I made the decision at the beginning of 08, fortunately 6 months before Lehman Brothers, to get out of the bank. And I basically redid my own personal finances and real estate, and I, for 2.5 years, got out of the banks completely. If I had not, I probably wouldn't have survived, because our industry had zero bank support. So I basically survived until the last couple of years on my own personal assets, and with zero support from the bank. So what I'm saying with that is that you're part of a larger system, which operates to certain rules and certain things. Having said that, I do want to mention one other thing. I think there are some policy choices made, and Hari mentioned the fact that, or somebody mentioned that we had a Mexican option rather than the Chinese option. And what we've been able to do is, I believe in the idea that North America as a strategy could work, by using Canada, U.S., and Mexico, and maybe Central America to compete with the world. If you go back to particularly Northern Europe, back to Germany, I was in there in the early 80s. They had these marvelous German words called Ostausschuss, which is sort of shot to the east. But they were in there 10 or 15 years before the end of communism, building relationships to saying, when communism ends, we want to develop that relationship, and we work the lower cost economy, our economy together. And even today, Germany has actually contract workers from there inside Germany, which often isn't known. So the Germans and Dutch and these learned to work symbiotically with these societies, where they would upgrade the jobs in Poland, later on further east, and also to balance them out. So it wasn't only what Germany did inside, it's Germany's relationship to the region that was part of their success. In North America, the Americans particularly treat Mexico as a problem rather than opportunity. We could have done equally well. Mexico is a fabulous place to work with great people. But we largely missed the opportunity because it was perceived as a problem rather than opportunity. And at the margin, probably several million more jobs could have stayed in North America by learning to do this. So some of them are strategically, we have to be smart. And again, I think in North America, we have not been. So it's not just that I can compete in Winnipeg all the time by doing things, but within regional other strategies, these are not subsidies, nothing. There were strategies available to us that were not used.
On that note, I would like to, Hari?
Can I just ask a quick question to Michael? I'm sorry.
Sure.
Michael has mentioned that one of the reasons behind this crisis is short-term focus, and the solution is having a long-term focus. As a business academic, when you do strategy research, we are looking at long-term profit is about 7 to 10 years, something like that. Short-term would be like 1 year or quarterly. So what is your long-term as an economist? I mean, what's the long-term that we need to see?
as an economist, as long as it takes to solve the problem. But I think what I was speaking about there was really the transition of what happened when your students and business students got out and became bankers, right? And that they viewed short term in terms of what they had to pay for the shareholders. And so by maximizing that, they maximized their own compensation. And so, it really warped the incentive system. And I can't, I will be an economist here and tell you that I can't give you a definition of what long-term and short-term is, because in every situation it actually is different, right? And here, I think we're looking at something that's evolved over a fairly long period of time, 30 years. And so we're certainly not going to solve it, in 6 months or 1 year, because it's going to really take a change of direction.
Well, I have a comment on the long term that comes to mind that I can conclude with. John Maynard Keynes, he said, in the long run, we're all dead, right? But before we do that, you and I are capable of taking bites of elephants. So on that note, let us begin and continue biting together into the problems we face. Thank you for coming.
The businesses that were successful were in fact those ones that had enough cash. And what's happening now is that they're all accumulating cash.
That's why they're saying I won't do that again.
That's right. And so everybody's accumulating cash.
Another question. Paul Earl?
I guess my question goes to all the panel members, really. It seems to me, as I think about this Occupy movement, and have spent, 30, 40 years thinking about society and injustice and so on, it seems to me that the issue of income inequality is secondary. It's a result rather than a first cause. And it strikes me that the real cause of income inequality is power inequality. Power inequality is where the problem lies, to me, not so much an income inequality. And I'm just wondering if any of the panelists have thought about it in those terms, and thought about if they find they agree with me at all, what would you do about power inequality? Because I'll just add one thought, and that is power inequality leads to income inequality, leads to power inequality, leads to income inequality, and so you end up in quite a vicious circle. So I wonder if any of the panelists have some reaction to that.
Does anyone want to speak to that? The role of power as underlying. Please.
Since I've worked with power, I just remember engraved on my memory is a meeting with Ian Denham, who was the Minister for Technology, I believe, or maybe Industry. That's right, Industry under the Labour government. And he was talking about how you use government to make things happen. And he said, I spent my whole life trying to get my hands on the levers of power, only to find they weren't connected to anything. So that I think the real problem is that what you have in society is dysfunctional. People pursue aims which as individuals appear rational, but they have social consequences which are completely irrational, and this is now manifesting itself in a dysfunctional and irrational society. So it's true. I mean, why do people want lots of money? I used to ask my undergraduate students, what would you do if you had $1 million? And they said, I'd buy a yacht. And then, what would you do if you had 10 million? I'd buy a big yacht. And then you just bid up, and then you get to about 100 million, and they say, you know what, I'd get 2 big yachts. And you say, why? And they say, because all my friends would be impressed. I mean, it's just no longer about, you can't do anything with that much money. So it becomes about power. Yet, there's the myth of the, not the myth, the folk tale of the lonely rich man. What does that tell us? You know, money doesn't buy everything. If it really doesn't buy everything, why is it that people want so much of it? It's dysfunctional, it's irrational. They think it brings power, they think it brings distinction, they think it brings satisfaction. It doesn't, and that's spreading out from the individuals who are involved to the society as a whole, is what I think we're now seeing. So my answer would be, yes, they want it, but they don't get it.
Let me just offer one comment before I go over to Rick. One of the things I do remember from this Robert Reich book I alluded to earlier in the evening was the statistic he talked about in terms of the concentration of wealth. What's interesting was his observation about what people with a lot of money do. And one of the things he observes is that their investment behaviors are different. They're not George Bailey who built Baileytown. You remember It's a Wonderful Life we're all going to watch this month? They typically speculate more, and they invest in really high-priced toys. Now, that's significant. Now, Alan's comment is also raising a really good question, and I know I've had a number of people, I've seen you here tonight, who have been in the MBA course in executive irresponsibilities, I almost said, in executive responsibilities. Where are you? Can you put your hands up? There's a number of people. One of the books that they've read in that course is called Money and the Meaning of Life. It's an interesting book. What does money mean for us? Something to think about if you're looking for a title to look further at. Rick, you had a question.
Yes, I think all the panelists have missed a key point from my world. It's called globalization. And let me give you some specifics. Manufacturing, we've seen all those jobs go offshore. China, go to Walmart, look at where everything is made. That is necessary for business. It's now going into the white-collar professional classes. Someone mentioned the Tata Group. It may surprise you to know that right now in Winnipeg, there's 150 people from Tata working, doing IT application development. Those are jobs that are basically coming in at $30 an hour. And they're growing exponentially. There's radiologists now whose work is being outsourced to India, where you do the work overnight and it's turned around. And the radiologists may find, if the physicians' unions are not able to prevent it, that that's going to be the next wave. And I've been spending 42 years in the IT industry seeing this whole phenomena. So I would say, from my perspective, it comes down to one thing. You have to have the right skills in this marketplace to be able to be successful. And the right skills are those where you have interpersonal skills, you have business skills. Otherwise, you won't be able to compete, and you will become the disenfranchised because globalization is not going to stop. And none of you have mentioned that. And one more thing I would add. When I was driving into work the other day, the CBC was interviewing somebody from Memorial Park for the Occupy movement. It was a young woman, and she had had an undergraduate degree in anthropology. And she was complaining that all she can get is a job as a waitress. Did anyone ever tell her from the university or her high school to say, if you get an undergraduate degree in anthropology without going to a PhD to be a professor, you will not be able to get a good career? I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. Art, I know you've had to do this thing with globalization, where you move your manufacturing offshore. So I'd like the panelists to talk about that, because that is the here and now. That's not just theory. This is what's happening today.
Any comments from the panel on the global realities of the marketplace and what we can't go back to? In fact, before I call on my dean, who just leaned over as you were speaking and showed me his third point was globalization. So he's one step ahead of you. I'll ask the panelists if they have anything they'd like to contribute in terms of what Rick's mentioned.
I think what globalization has done is in part it's created some of the tools for this inequality to spread faster. And yet you go to certain societies where it has not done, has it had a different impact. Germany certainly being a case in point, some other things. And I've spent a lot of time in Germany. One of the big things is their system of education and some of the values that are associated with that. So I think that the globalization is very real. And we're just talking to the professor earlier about the fact he's used my business case of Palliser Furniture, Mexico versus China. I think it's taught by almost every student in Canada that studies that case. What's interesting is today I am growing in Winnipeg and in Mexico, and I'm growing 40% in the US this year, taking business back from China. So China was an 8-year phenomenon, and one of the questions that I ask as a policymaker, do you destroy industries because China has an 8-year sort of spot advantage based on some particular artificial situations partly over there? So we lose an interest in industry, in many industries, because of a very short-term phenomenon. And that's another question. So that's a policy question. But yes, globalization, I think, allowed some of this thing to become more severe. But again, I point out not every society responded the same way. Some have dealt with it better than others. There is a policy choice.
Alan?
Yeah, I'm sort of quite unique. I'm probably one of 2 people in this room who think that globalization didn't exist. Okay? It's a synonym for something else. And the big thing that people forget is that what has been called globalization is accompanied by a massive growth in inequality between nations. This is something that I've specialized in researching. And from about 1980, from the sort of early era of liberalization up to about 2000, the ratio of the median income of the poorest to the richest nation doubled, trebled. I mean, the sort of inequalities we're talking about within our countries are as nothing compared with the inequalities we've seen worldwide. If it were not for that, people would not be offshoring. They're offshoring because they find labor whose income has been driven down to the stage where 1 billion people in the world today don't have enough to live on. I mean, we're not talking about living wage in terms of supporting your family. They die, right? Now, end that and you finish the problem. And then I'm going to turn that around and say, I think actually in the future, I'm getting very kind of messianical here, but I think you're going to face a different problem, because I was in China a while back and I talked to a very eminent economist who I greatly respect called Henry K. Liu. New York-based, very good political connections in China. I advise everybody to read his stuff. It's all on the web. And he said that on his advice, he does tend to emphasize the advice he gives people, but in the Chinese Communist Party at its last conference adopted a plan which envisaged a 25% annual increase in wages in China for the next 5 years. I was also in Yaroslavl at the Global Policy Forum, which was the town where, I don't know if you remember, there was tragically a crash of the ice hockey team. We were actually having a meeting there at the time, and it was explained that the policy of United Russia, and I think this policy will be implemented despite the difficulties that party is in, was to increase state wage employees by 15% a year for the next 5 years. So those emerging economies are actually embarking on a strategy of raising wages, both to deal with their domestic demand, because they see they can't have export-led growth anymore, and also because of the social instability that they're frightened of in their own countries. Now, when that completes, and I think it's, I've had a lot of discussion with economists and people worldwide, and I think there's the beginnings of a consensus that that's a move. You are going to see the end of cheap labor worldwide. Then you're going to be complaining about something entirely different, which is all the stuff you go buy from China now for next to nothing is going to cost. And you know who's going to be paying for it most? Poor people. So you think poor people are angry now, you wait till stuff gets expensive. Then you'll see something.
Anyone else from the panel? Hari.
I'm going to address both Paul's question and your question together. Essentially what Paul said was that it is power inequality, not income inequality. And what you're saying is that it's globalization, not income inequality. The reason why I would like to look at it as income inequality is that we can look at other things that are influencing it for sure. But when we talk about income inequality, it is something that affects us, something in which we have a role to play. We can take some action. It's individualized. Whereas power or globalization are some things that can be abstracted to something else, so we don't have to take action. So personally, I would like to kind of talk about being able to reflect on some of these issues and see if we can take one small step that can make a difference. So that is the way I was thinking about. And in terms of globalization, not all industries have responded in the same fashion. Like, that's one of the things that, as Art was mentioning, the case that we talk about, is that they did not go to China, like they did not develop that strategy, but they still are doing well, purely because their strategy was different. Right? So you need to have that clear strategy. So those are some of the thoughts that I have.
It's interesting, Thomas Friedman said the world is not flat, or the world is flat, I should say, and somebody else said it's not flat, it's bumpy. I think one of the things we can say is it is dynamic, and stay tuned. I mean, on the other side, some of these problems do not leave us off the hook, I would dare say. And I always remember one of my favorite one-liners is, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So our choices potentially, not even potentially, actually, are significant. We're going to take one more question, then I'm going to call in our dean to offer his concluding remarks.
Yeah, it's actually more like a comment, because I think people talk about and I really like what you said, Hari. People talked about globalization, first of all, as it was something that was just happening, that was not being done by anybody, but I would seriously question that. But I think more to the point, I just want to come back, I think Art Defer mentioned that not all countries responded in the same way. Hari mentioned not all companies responded in the same way. And I think I would add one further thing to that, which is that globalization was used as a ruse to reduce wages in the West. It was basically, you argue that unless you bring your wages down, your jobs will go away. But, and of course, there's this trope, and of course, in reality, I agree, not as many jobs as you'd imagine have gone away. And in fact, if they've gone, they've more often gone in search of markets than they've gone in search of low wages. Further, one more thing. When the Japanese experienced the same phenomenon, which is that lower wage jobs migrated elsewhere, they actually developed a lovely metaphor for it, which helped them adapt, which was the flying geese metaphor, in which it was accepted that as Japan progressed, it would have to constantly retooled for higher skilled jobs, and that it was to be expected that the lower skilled jobs would go to the peripheral countries around Japan. And in fact, this has now developed several layers, so that, Korea is now shedding jobs, and so is China, in fact. Whereas we simply use it, and particularly in the English-speaking countries, to say, we should take wages down. And incidentally, Robert Reich, who Reg mentioned earlier, one of his earlier works, was the book called The Work of Nations, which effectively suggested the same sort of strategy for the United States. And in fact, Clinton, in his first campaign, took this on board and made him Secretary of Labor and all those things. But somewhere along the way, this effectively productivist agenda, which all of you talked about, why production is important, a lot of this financial stuff is not productive, etc. This productivist agenda was jettisoned in favor of a purely financial agenda, and I think this is the important thing we have also to look at. So there are people who have had these ideas, the same ideas for the United States and for other Western economies, but they have not been implemented, and I think this is important. At the end of the day, you don't want to keep Stone Age technology. You want to move up the technological ladder. That is what's called development. Development is precisely about raising wages, which then brings you to the odd situation where even third world countries were told, bring down your wages, take away your union regulations, and only then you'll get development, completely forgetting that development was precisely about raising wages. It was precisely about having good working conditions, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. That was Radhika Desai from Department of Political Studies at the U of M, and I just mentioned this because we're having a second conversation tomorrow at 2:30 in room 343 of the Drake Center, and you're more than welcome to continue the discussion then. Radhika will be on that panel, and thank you for setting the stage for what follows.